Hey everyone and welcome back to a new video. It's quite common to be impressed by the quality of new Warhammer models these days. The sculpts are truly getting better and better, and however we might feel about the games themselves or which factions seem to be getting more updates than others, I don't think we can say Games Workshop is losing the art of modelling itself. And to that end, I think the new demonic Fulgrim model shows that we're pushing new heights on that already elevated benchmark. Yes, it's resin and yes, it's only for the Horus Heresy, but the model itself is remarkable, and in this video I wanted to take a closer look and talk about some of the features that impress me most. I'm sure you'll all have your own thoughts about the model, so do share them in the comments section below, but with all that said, let's take a closer look at Fulgrim Transfigured. Just before I talk about the model specifics though, it's worth pointing out that this was somewhat announced a few months ago. Games Workshop has already released models for all 18 active Primarchs in the Horus Heresy, but they capture those characters during the very early clashes, and as many of us know, some of those Primarchs, Fulgrim included, changed quite a bit over the course of that era. So Games Workshop has begun to update those Primarch models to reflect how they were during the later stages of the Heresy, and started with the Horus Ascended model. Fulgrim is now the second update, and it's fair to say that we can probably guess at least another 3 that will also be getting updates over the coming months and years, which will be interesting for those who already have their counterparts in Warhammer 40k. But in any case, that's another conversation. Let's talk about the details of the model itself. What immediately stands out to me with this new Fulgrim sculpt is the exquisite detail, particularly of the armour. The way the plated sheets blend so well into the serpentine scales and vice versa evokes a great sense of flow to the model as you look it up and down, and the texture it creates allows for these subtle hues of purple that again keep the eyes dancing all over it. We also see other subtle details that gesture towards the character of Fulgrim and some of the aspects that make him so interesting in my mind. Adorned with all this glittering armour and regalia, we also see these straps on his midriff and the gloved hand. I'm sure you can probably guess as to their purposes, but in my mind they help to illustrate the contrast at the heart of Fulgrim as a being. He's both perfect and perverse, delicate and crude, and we can see that subtle balance play out on almost every aspect of this model, and it's fantastic. There's another feature though that gets me thinking. On his back we have these ropes sewn into his skin, and more than anything else it gives me the impression of a corset. In essence, it reminds us that this image of Fulgrim is a facade, a costume of sorts, and given the motif, perhaps one that threatens to burst off if a measure of control isn't maintained. I wonder if that suggests how his 40k version might be different in some way. Of course, a core aspect of the traitor Primarchs is their betrayal of the Emperor, and one of the great contrasts between the current heresy models of Mortarion, Magnus and Angron and their 40k visages is the way their newer forms often mock what they once were as a malicious stab at the Emperor's fallibility. The same applies to Fulgrim, and it's perhaps a bit more explicit because, having been granted permission by the Emperor to wear the Palatine Aquila and bear his name, Fulgrim and the Emperor's children were literally living emblems of the Emperor, and the corruption is an even weightier insult as a result. To give an example, the insignia of the Emperor's children that Fulgrim wears, which incorporates the Palatine Aquila, has been subtly corrupted. The clawed foot and jaw, which mimics the iconography of Slanesh, remains glittering and beautiful, while the wings of the Emperor's sigil are ugly and defiled. It's another subtle contrast, but one that perhaps captures Fulgrim's deeper feelings and motivations. Similarly, and I'm sure it's partly coincidental, but the way the Aquila flows away from Fulgrim over the backdrop of his demonic wings implies how Fulgrim perhaps sees his apotheosis as a greater gift than what the Emperor bestowed, and perhaps an ascendance above everything his own father ever hoped to be. Again, it's perhaps a coincidence, but it's another great example of how this model spurs the imagination with every detail. Moving on, one of the details that I find myself lingering on is his face, and for largely obvious reasons. It's a fantastically detailed part of the model. It's also very different to the earlier Fulgrim model for the Horus Heresy. With that one there's plenty of emotion, which makes sense given it largely represents him during the Battle of Isfahan 5, when he fought his closest brother Ferrus Manus and killed him in single combat. That was a moment of intense emotion, rage, shame and pain for Fulgrim, too much in fact, because it led him to submit wholly to the demonic presence within him and set him on the path to what he is today. This newer model though has a much calmer, more sinister expression. Again, it points to the idea that this is a literal mask the demon wears, but we do know that Fulgrim is capable of bouts of fury and rage thanks to the recent Horus Heresy books. So with that in mind, the expression also comes across as one of extreme confidence, subtle excitement and, dare I say say, a hint of desire and intrigue. I think it's one of those faces you can interpret in a lot of different ways, and given the volatility of Fulgrim's emotions, I think it's a delicate middle ground for the Primarch. Speaking of delicate balances, I do want to talk about the model's pose for a moment. Like the expression, it feels relaxed and prepared, but when you think about the serpentine nature of the model, I think it also has an element of threat to it. I'm no snake expert, but some breeds will raise themselves and posture in front of their prey or other predators to extenuate their size and dominance. It's something a lot of animals do in fact, and I think this enormous raised stance is also a posture for Fulgrim, bearing down on his target, and maybe this also explains his expression, trying to scrutinise the terror in their eyes. But largely speaking, I think it points to the primal nature of demons in Warhammer, and that of Fulgrim as a demon Primarch. While he's still a complex character, we also know him to be driven by simple desires and primal instincts, and the model seems to capture a moment where that's as true as ever. Now, often in videos like this, I like to talk about the base of the model because Games Workshop do a really great job of injecting story elements and implied narratives. However, this one represents an interesting departure from previous Primarch models in that it's not as busy as we've seen before. The previous Fulgrim and even the recent Horus Ascended models are not lacking in Fallen Astartes to adorn their bases, but this model at first glance seems a little simpler. However, in the trailer we get a better angle of the ruins on Fulgrim's base, and not only do we see a fallen Imperial fist, but a piece of masonry inscribed with the name of Saturnine. Now, this is a clear reference to the Siege of Terror book by Dan Abnett, in which we see Fulgrim lead an attack on the Saturnine Gate, and as a warning, I just want to explain one of the key plot points. There might be a bit of a spoiler here. Anyways, in one of the climaxes of that attack, Fulgrim faces down Rogel Dawn on the walls of the Imperial Palace, and is forced to reveal his demonic form before effectively getting bored of the fighting and leaving the siege altogether. However, later in the book, Dawn reveals to Sanguinius that Fulgrim not only could have taken the Saturnine Gate, but he could have also won the entire siege if Perturabo had been able to utilise him fully. That's a huge omission for Dawn, but bringing it back to the base, it creates an incredible narrative. In essence, Fulgrim stands upon a ruined section of the Saturnine Gate when we know him to be at his most powerful and his most dangerous, but it was also his moment of greatest weakness when his fickle and spontaneous desires saw him turn away from the battle and hand victory to his enemies. Saturnine itself illustrates the immense conflict in Fulgrim's own nature and speaks to his core flaw. His insatiable and fleeting desires will always be an unstable foundation for him, just like the crumbling ruins he attempts to proudly loom over here, and his pride will often be his greatest undoing. It's a wonderful part of the model, and the connotations immediately get me thinking about how those literal and figurative foundations might have changed for Fulgrim over the course of 10,000 years. Maybe we'll find out soon. So those are just a few of my own thoughts on the brand new Fulgrim model. Again, it's truly outstanding, and there's so much I've not even mentioned that I could talk about for ages. And while I'm also feeling a sense of grief that we have to wait a bit longer for a new 40k version, I'm quite excited that this model is giving us a glimpse into what's possible. But I'm keen to hear your thoughts. What do you think of the model? Are you planning on purchasing it? And how do you think the 40k version of Fulgrim will look different to this one? Let me know in the comments section. And as always, a big thank you for joining me today. If you enjoyed the video, please do click the like button and subscribe if you want to join me for future Warhammer content, and I hope you'll join me for my next video. Until then, however, take care.